The first person to stop speaking was the miller's wife, and no one thought much of it. Margaret Hole had never been a talkative woman. Her silence on the morning of the 3rd of December was noted by her husband only in the sense that he was aware of it without being troubled by it. The way a man becomes aware of the absence of a sound he has grown too accustomed to notice. She set his breakfast on the table and poured his coffee and stood at the window looking out at the valley for a while, and when he asked her if she had slept, she turned and looked at him and opened her mouth and then closed it again, and he thought nothing of this because she sometimes did that, began to speak and then decided the thing was not worth saying. He ate his breakfast and went to the mill. That evening she was the same, not withdrawn, not distressed, not in any way that would have caused him alarm. She made their supper and sat across the table and looked at him when he spoke and responded, but not with words. With a gesture, a nod, the particular tilt of her head that meant agreement, or the slight contraction of her brow that meant she was uncertain. When he asked her directly if she was feeling well, she looked at him for a moment, and then nodded once, clearly, and went back to her supper. He slept without concern. By the following evening, there were 4 others. Ezra Hatch had not spoken since noon, and his wife could not say exactly when she had noticed, because the absence had crept in rather than arrived. The Garfield boy, who was 11 and rarely silent under any circumstances, had sat through supper without a word, staring at the table with an expression his mother could not read. The woman who kept the trading post at the south end of the valley, a widow named Prentice, who conducted all her business in rapid, efficient speech, had locked her door at midday and not opened it again. And August Collum, who was 73 years old and had lived in Harrow Valley since before it was called Harrow Valley, had come to the door of his son's house that evening and stood in the cold for a long time before his son noticed him and opened the door. And when he was brought inside and sat by the fire, he looked at his son and his son's wife and their 3 children with an expression that his son would describe later, to anyone who would listen, as the expression of a man who has been trying to say something for a very long time and has finally accepted that he will not be able to. August Collum had not spoken, but he had tried. His son was certain of that. He had opened his mouth and shaped it toward words, and the words had not come, and what was in his eyes in that moment was not confusion, it was recognition. The recognition of a man who has encountered something before and knows, from the previous encounter, what comes next. His son had not understood this at the time. He understood it later. What August Collum had recognized was the silence. And the silence in Harrow Valley in the first week of December, 1859, was not an absence of sound. It was the sound of something arriving. The valley itself has a quality that is worth understanding before the events of December 1859 can be properly placed within it. Harrow Valley lay in a fold of the western Missouri highlands, a long, narrow crease in the upland country running roughly north to south between 2 parallel ridges, with a creek running through its floor and good bottomland on either side of the creek that had made it attractive to settlers beginning in the early 1840s. By 1859, it held perhaps 200 people in a loose arrangement of farms and homesteads anchored by a small cluster of commercial enterprises at its southern end. The mill, the trading post, a blacksmith, a small tavern that served the community's social function as much as its commercial one. It was a contained place. The ridges on either side were high enough that the valley had a quality of enclosure that its residents were accustomed to, and visitors sometimes found oppressive. The road in from the south was the primary access. A secondary track climbed the east ridge to a gap and connected to the broader highland country, but it was steep and difficult, and not much used in any season. August Column had come to the valley in 1831, with the first family to settle it. The family of his wife's brother, who had scouted the land the previous year and come back with a description that made it sound like a place worth the difficulty of getting there. He had been 45 years old. He had built his first cabin in the valley's second year, and his second, larger one, in its fifth, and he had farmed the same ground for 28 years. His wife had died in the valley. 2 of his children had been born in it. He knew its character in every season and every kind of weather, the way a man knows the character of a person he has lived beside for decades. The ordinary moods, the predictable patterns, and the rarer, more significant departures from pattern that a long-time resident recognized and a newcomer could not. He had seen the valley go quiet before. This is the thing that distinguishes August Column's account from every other account of what happened in December of 1859. He was not encountering a mystery. He was encountering a repetition. And a man who has seen a thing twice holds it differently than a man who has seen it once, holds it with a specific gravity, a settled knowledge that changes the character of fear into something more like resigned understanding. He was not afraid in December of 1859. He was, if anything, tired. Tired in the way of a man who has been carrying a truth for 16 years and watching the world decline to receive it, and who now finds himself in the position of needing to deliver it quickly, in a diminishing window of voice, to people who have no reason to believe him, and every practical reason to dismiss what he says. He had seen the valley go quiet before. Once, in the winter of 1843. He had been 57 years old, still vigorous, still farming his full acreage, and the winter that year had come early and with a peculiar quality that he had not been able to name at the time and had spent 16 years thinking about since. The silence then had begun in the same way, gradually, selectively, taking people one at a time over the course of 3 or 4 days, until the valley had a character that made it feel less like a community of people and more like a community of the idea of people, the outward shapes of lives being lived without the sound that living made. In 1843, the blizzard had come on the 6th day. It had lasted 9 days. It had killed 4 people in the valley, buried 2 cabins to the roofline, collapsed the original mill structure, and been described by the survivors as the worst weather event in the memory of the highland country. When it passed, and the silence lifted with it, gradually, over 2 or 3 days, voices returning one by one the same way they had departed, August Column had gone to his neighbors and tried to tell them what he had observed. He had tried to tell them that the silence was not a symptom of the blizzard, but a forewarning of it, that something in the valley had known the storm was coming before any natural sign had shown it, and that this knowledge had expressed itself through the people in the valley in the only way available to it, which was to take their speech. He had not been taken seriously. He was not an eccentric man or a superstitious one, which made the account land strangely. People acknowledged that he had observed something. They offered explanations. The oppressive early cold produced a kind of stupor that affected speech, or the psychological weight of isolation under bad weather created symptoms in susceptible individuals, or the particular quality of the valley's air in extreme cold interfered with the mechanism of voice in ways that were not well understood. These were not satisfying explanations, but they were the available ones, and people preferred them to the alternative, which was to accept that something in the land had spoken through them without their consent. August Column had accepted their preference and said no more about it. He had waited 16 years. Now he sat by his son's fire and looked at the faces of people who did not yet know what was happening to them, and he tried to speak, and the valley had already taken his voice, and there was nothing he could do but watch. His son was a man named Daniel Collum, 40 years old, who had grown up in the valley and had his father's practical temperament without his father's long memory of the place. He was a farmer and a capable one, not given to worry or to the kind of retrospective thinking that would have led him to recall his father's account of 1843 and place it alongside what he was now observing. He noticed that his father could not speak. He noticed that his children could not speak. He noticed that his wife could speak only in a diminished way, her words coming out shortened and effortful, the sentences trailing off before they completed. He himself could speak, and he did, at some length, in the way of a man trying to fill with his own voice the space that other voices had left empty. He asked questions. He received gestures in return. He went to the neighbors and found 4 of them mute and 2 more partially so, their speech reduced to fragments, half-words, the beginnings of sentences that stopped. He could not find a pattern. The silence did not follow family lines or property lines or any geography of the valley that he could identify. It seemed random in its selection. The miller's wife, a child, a widow, his own father, a farmer from the north end of the valley. No common factor he could name. He also, on that first day of organizing, went back to his father. He found August Collum in the same chair by the fire, which was where he would remain for most of the time before the convoy left. Not out of incapacity, but out of what Daniel came to understand as a kind of deliberate stillness, the stillness of a man conserving something. His father looked at him when he came in, and Daniel pulled a chair close and spoke quietly, though the children were in the next room and the house was not large. He said, "What do I need to know? Tell me what you remember from 1843. Everything." His father reached for the paper and pencil that Greer had given him and wrote for several minutes. When he handed the paper to Daniel, it held a careful account compressed into the space available of what the winter of 1843 had done. The sequence of the silence, the rate at which it spread, the point at which it had been total. The character of the blizzard itself, the duration, the depth of snow, the cold, the deaths, the period of recovery afterward. At the bottom he had written, "The silence lifted on the 2nd day after the storm passed its peak." Not its end, its peak. The storm ran for 9 days. The voices came back on the 7th day. People assumed the storm breaking had returned the voices. I do not think that is what happened. I think the valley was finished with what it needed by the 7th day and released what it had taken. The storm itself continued for 2 more days regardless. Daniel read this carefully. He said, "What did it need? The silence. What was it for?" His father looked at him for a long moment. Then he wrote, "I have thought about this for 16 years. My best answer is that the valley goes quiet before the storm, the way a person goes quiet before they say something important. Not the storm's preparation, the valley's preparation, for something the storm enables, or expresses, or completes. I do not know what that something is. I only know the silence is not random and not incidental." Daniel said nothing. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He sat with his father for a while in the warmth of the fire, and then he went back out into the cold. He went to the man in the valley best suited to advise him on medical matters, a former physician's assistant named Greer, who had come to the valley in the early 50s, and who served in the absence of any proper doctor as the community's primary recourse for illness and injury. Greer was a careful and honest man who was explicit about the limits of his knowledge, which Daniel had always appreciated. Greer listened to Daniel's account. He had his own observations to add. He had noticed 3 cases in the past 2 days. people who had come to him or been brought to him by family, members unable to explain the sudden failure of speech. He had examined them. He found nothing. No throat inflammation, no apparent obstruction, no fever, no other symptom of illness. The mechanism of the voice appeared intact. The will to speak appeared intact. The words simply did not come. He said he did not know what he was looking at. He said, "Your father has seen this before." Daniel said, "My father cannot speak." Greer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. He came to me this morning. Before he lost it entirely, he came to me, and I could see he was trying to tell me something, and he could not get it out. I gave him paper and a pencil." Daniel said, "What did he write?" Greer went to his shelf and took down a folded piece of paper and opened it on the table. August Cullum's handwriting was old-fashioned and precise, the script of a man who had learned to write in an earlier era and had maintained the habit with care. The words on the paper were these: "It happened before. 1843. The silence comes first, and the storm follows. 6 days between them in 1843. Count from the first one who cannot speak. The storm will be worse than anything the valley has seen. Do not wait for it. Get the people out while there is still voice enough to organize them." Daniel read this twice. He looked at Greer. He said, "How many people have lost their voices?" Greer said he had counted 11 confirmed and suspected perhaps 6 more based on reports from families. Daniel asked, "What day did it start?" Greer said, "The 3rd of December, Margaret Hole." Daniel was quiet for a moment, calculating. He said, "That was 3 days ago." Greer said, "Yes, 3 days gone, 3 days remaining, if his father's accounting was correct. 3 days to organize 200 people in a valley, with one road out, in the beginning of winter, on the word of an old man who could no longer speak, and a pattern that had occurred exactly once before, 16 years ago, and had not been taken seriously at the time." He picked up the paper and went home. The next morning he went door to door. He brought the paper. He showed it to every family he could reach, reading it aloud when he read it, and leaving it for a moment for those who wanted to hold it themselves. He told them what he knew, which was limited. 11 people unable to speak, the number growing, a warning from a man who had lived in this valley since before most of them were born. The responses were what he expected, which was not one thing but several things simultaneously. There was skepticism. A pattern drawn from a single prior instance was not a pattern, some said, and an old man's memory of an event 16 years past was not a reliable foundation for disrupting the lives of 200 people in the dead of winter. There was the practical objection. December travel on the mountain roads was dangerous. Taking families out of their winter-ready homes into cold and uncertain country on the strength of a handwritten note was its own kind of risk. There was also, he noticed, fear. Not articulated, not admitted, but present in the way that fear is present when people talk too quickly, or repeat themselves, or fix their eyes on a point slightly past your shoulder while you are speaking to them. They were afraid, and they were managing their fear by maintaining the argument against it. He went to 9 families that morning. He could not reach the north end of the valley in one day. He planned to go further in the afternoon. At the 4th house he visited, the husband opened the door and spoke normally, and the wife stood behind him and did not. She was not distressed. She looked at Daniel with calm, clear eyes, and when her husband relayed what Daniel said, she nodded slowly, and when the husband asked if she agreed to go, she nodded again, and that was the full extent of her participation in a decision about abandoning her home in December. At the sixth house, no one came to the door when he knocked, and when he pushed it open, he found the family at their breakfast table. Father, mother, 3 children, all of them silent, all of them looking at the door with expressions he could not read and did not try to. The youngest child, who was perhaps 5, had been eating porridge and had a spoon in her hand, and she simply looked at him with the large, direct gaze of a young child and said nothing and went back to her porridge when he set the paper on the table. He left the paper on the table and went. At the 7th house, the man who answered was one of the valley's most capable and sensible farmers, a man Daniel respected and trusted. He listened to Daniel's account without interruption and read the paper and handed it back and said, "What do you need?" Daniel said, "Help, someone to take the north end while I take the south." The man said, "Give me an hour." His name was Fletcher, and he is one of the reasons any of what happened next was possible. They spent the rest of that afternoon moving through the valley, going door to door in the order that made the most geographic sense, covering the southern half, while Fletcher worked north from the center. At each house, the conversation followed a similar arc. Daniel explained. He showed the paper. He waited. He answered the objections he could answer and acknowledged the ones he could not. He kept his voice steady and his manner practical, because he had understood early in the afternoon that the most useful thing he could do was refuse to be afraid, or refuse to show that he was, which in practice amounted to the same thing. At 2 of the houses he visited, the silence had arrived while he was standing in the doorway. Not dramatically. He would not have noticed if he had not been listening for it. The man at one house had been speaking normally, moderately skeptical, asking reasonable questions about the route and the logistics, and then, in the middle of a sentence, he had stopped. Not because he had finished the thought. The sentence simply ceased. He had stood for a moment and then tried again, and the attempt produced nothing. His mouth moved. The breath came, but no voice. He had looked at Daniel with an expression that was half bewilderment and half the beginning of understanding, and Daniel had taken his arm and said, "Pack what you need for a week. I will wait." The man had packed. His wife had packed. They had come. By evening, when the light failed and Daniel could no longer move safely between properties, he had spoken to 31 families. 23 of them had agreed to go. 8 had declined or been unreachable. He went home and made his lists and tried to eat something and did not sleep well and was up before dawn. By the afternoon of the 4th day, 17 people in Harrow Valley could not speak. The silence was accelerating. In the first 2 days, it had taken perhaps 8 people, slowly enough that it had gone unnoticed as a pattern until Daniel began counting. In the 3rd day, it had taken 3 more. In the morning of the 4th day, 4. The rate of spread was increasing in the way of a fire that has found its fuel and begun to feed. Daniel had developed, by necessity, a system for tracking the affected. He moved through the valley each morning and each evening with a written list, checking each household, marking changes. It was a grim kind of accounting, not a record of illness exactly, because there was no illness to record, no fever, no pain, no deterioration of the body. Only the voice, only the specific and total absence of the voice in people who were otherwise themselves, who ate, who worked, who tended their animals and their children and their households, who looked at you with clear and present eyes and communicated everything they needed to communicate without a word. What he found hardest, he would say later, was not the silence itself, but the communication that persisted inside it. The affected had not become unreachable. They had become differently reachable. A gesture from his father said more than most men said in a paragraph. A look from the miller's wife when he stopped to check on the household carried a weight of meaning that her words, in his experience of her, had never quite managed, as though the taking of their voices had stripped away everything peripheral and left only what was essential, the core of what they were trying to say, expressed in whatever medium remained. He found this observation disturbing in a way he could not immediately account for, and when he examined the disturbance, he understood it. It implied that the silence had not simply removed something. It had also revealed something, and a thing that could do both, take and reveal simultaneously, was a thing that understood what it was taking. A thing with intention toward its subjects. He did not speak this aloud. He wrote it in his journal that evening, and then crossed it out, and then left it crossed out, because the crossing out felt dishonest, and the honesty felt necessary. He continued his rounds. Daniel could still speak. His voice was his, full and clear, and he used it constantly, organizing, persuading, arguing, repeating his father's warning to anyone who would hear it. Fletcher could still speak, and Fletcher's wife and Greer, and a dozen others who were working alongside Daniel to move the reluctant, and comfort the frightened, and pack what was essential, and get animals into a condition for travel. Not everyone could be persuaded. Of the roughly 40 families in the valley, 12 declined to go. Some of these were among the affected, people who could not speak their refusal, but communicated it through gesture and posture, and the simple act of sitting down at their own table and not moving. Others were unaffected and refused on practical grounds or stubbornness, or the specific pride of people who have survived hard country for years and do not accept the proposition that anything could make them leave their own home in December. Daniel went back to his father. August Cullum sat by the fire where he had been sitting for 2 days, and his expression when Daniel came in was the expression of a man watching something he cannot stop. His eyes were clear. His mind was clearly intact. He simply had no access to his voice, and he had exhausted the paper and pencil option in the note he had given Greer 2 days before, and what remained was his face, and his face said, "You are doing what can be done. That is all there is." Daniel sat with him for a while. He said, "In 1843, did people leave before the storm?" His father shook his head. He said, "Did the storm find them anyway?" His father looked at the fire for a long time. Then he nodded, once, slowly. Daniel said, "I'll get as many out as I can." His father reached over and put his hand on Daniel's arm and kept it there for a moment, and then let go, and went back to looking at the fire. Daniel went out into the cold. The convoy left on the morning of the 5th day. 63 people, 12 wagons and a collection of horses and mules and 2 milk cows that a family named Sutton refused to leave behind, and that in the end proved their worth when the group spent a night on the mountain road with no other source of food. Fletcher organized the wagons. Greer attended to those who were ill or elderly or otherwise required assistance. Daniel rode the length of the line, speaking to everyone, using his voice with the deliberate conservation of a man who has begun to understand that his voice is not entirely his own. The morning of departure had a quality he had not anticipated. He had expected difficulty, the slow work of getting people moving, the resistance of those still uncertain, the practical chaos of wagons and animals and families in close quarters in cold weather. There was some of this, but beneath it, and more striking than it, was a quality of silence that blanketed the entire process of leaving in a way that made it feel like something other than flight. The affected said nothing because they could not. The unaffected spoke in low voices, or not at all, as though the valley's silence had extended itself to them by proximity or sympathy. Even the children were quiet. Even the animals moved without their usual complaint. The valley let them go without sound. He thought about this as he rode the length of the line, checking each wagon, counting heads. 63 people moving out of a valley that held 200, on the strength of a warning from a man who could no longer speak. He thought about the 30 families staying, the 12 who had refused outright, and the ones he had not been able to reach, the ones on the far north end of the valley who would not know about the convoy until it was already gone, if they ever knew. He thought about what he was leaving behind, and whether leaving was the right name for it. His father was in the second wagon, wrapped in quilts, sitting upright with his back against the wagon's sideboard so he could watch the valley as they moved through it. He watched the farmsteads they passed, the familiar properties, the fields he had helped to clear 30 years earlier, the community he had lived inside since before it was a community. He watched it with an expression that Daniel, riding past him, saw from a distance and could not hold in his memory precisely afterward, could only say that it was not grief, and was not relief, and was something that required a different word he did not have. The road south climbed out of the valley floor over a low pass before descending to the broader highland plateau, and the climb was slow with loaded wagons in early December. The pass was not high by the standards of the highland country, but the road to it was narrow and steep in sections, and the frozen ruts from previous travel made the footing uncertain for the horses. Fletcher walked the steepest section, talking to the lead team of each wagon in the low, continuous murmur that experienced men use with nervous animals. Not quite words, not quite song, something between the two that carried information in its tone rather than its content. At the top of the pass, Daniel stopped his horse and looked back. The valley lay below him, visible in its entirety from this elevation for the first time. He had rarely seen it from above. He was struck, as he sometimes was, by familiar things seen from unfamiliar angles, by how different it looked, how contained, how perfectly shaped by its ridges into something that was almost a room, a closed and bounded space with a specific interior that was distinct from everything around it. He could see the smoke from the chimneys of the families who had stayed, thin columns rising straight in the windless morning, visible one by one against the white ground and the dark timber. 12 families. He counted the chimneys and arrived at a number he did not want to look at and looked away. They made the pass by midday. They descended onto the plateau by mid-afternoon. By the time the last wagon cleared the pass, the sky to the north, above the valley they had left, had a quality that Daniel had never seen and would never forget. Not the gray of ordinary storm cloud, not the blue-black of a severe thunderstorm, not any gradation of weather he had a name for. A white, a particular luminous white like the white of a sun seen through very thick cloud that covered the northern sky completely and was moving south at a pace that seemed, to a man on horseback watching it, slow and inevitable and absolute. He turned his horse and followed the wagons south. They camped that night on the plateau, in the shelter of a limestone bluff where the overhang gave them some protection, and the combined warmth of animals and people in close proximity kept the cold manageable. Fletcher built fires. The milk cows were a gift. People who could not speak sat at the edges of the firelight and held cups of warm milk and looked at nothing in particular, with eyes that were present but internal, turned toward something that was not visible from outside. He noticed that night that several of the people who had been speaking normally when they left the valley were quieter than they had been. Not silent, not like the affected. They responded when addressed. They spoke when necessity required it. But the ease had gone out of their speech. The words came slowly, with a slight effortfulness, as though something were pressing against them from the inside. He watched this, and did not say anything about it, and in the morning it seemed to have passed. He asked Greer about it quietly, out of earshot of the others. Greer said he had noticed the same thing. He said he thought the reach of whatever the valley was doing extended some distance beyond the valley itself, that the edge of the silence was not clean and sharp but diffuse, and that people who had been near the valley for the past several days had been at the edge of its reach even after they left. He said, "I think if we had stayed another day, we would have lost another 10. Daniel looked back at the ridge behind them, at the dark line of the pass against the white sky. He said, "I think if we had stayed another day, we would not have been able to organize ourselves to leave." Greer was quiet for a moment. He said, "Yes, I think that is likely." They said nothing more about it and went back to the fires. Daniel sat with his father that night, close to the fire. He asked questions that required only a nod or a shake, conserving the one-sided conversation into the essentials. Are you cold? Are you in pain? Are you frightened? His father shook his head to the last one. Not frightened. Daniel said, "What is it then?" His father looked at him for a long moment and then did something Daniel had not expected. He reached over and pointed, not at Daniel, not at the fire, but at the ground, at the earth under the snow. Daniel looked at the ground and then back at his father. His father kept pointing at the ground, at the plateau they were camped on, the highland country outside the valley, the ordinary world of stone and soil and tree. Then he pointed back in the direction they had come, over his shoulder, toward the valley hidden behind the dark ridge. Daniel waited. His father made the gesture again, and then a third time, and Daniel watched him do it and tried to understand what he was being shown. The ground here was different from the ground there. That was what the gesture said, as plainly as a gesture could say anything. The ground here, the plateau, the open country, was ground. The ground there, the valley, the place enclosed by its ridges, was something else. Something that the old man had spent 28 years living on and 16 years thinking about and still could not name except to say, "It is not the same. It has never been the same. What lives in that valley is not what lives out here, and what happens in that valley when the weather turns is not what happens anywhere else. And I have known this for a long time, and I could not make anyone hear me." Daniel looked at his father's face in the firelight. He said, "You tried to tell us." His father looked at him with the specific patience of a man who has learned to hold a thing for a very long time. Daniel said, "I'm sorry." His father shook his head. "Not your fault. Not anyone's fault. Simply the nature of the thing. Some information arrives too late to be useful, and the useful thing is to learn it for next time, if next time comes." He could not say any of this. He could not say anything, but his face said it with an economy that words would only have complicated. Daniel sat with him by the fire until his father slept, and then he sat alone for a while longer, listening to the wind that had come up from the north, and thinking about the valley on the other side of the ridge. He thought about the note, the line at the bottom that the historical record would later set aside as an unconnected notation. It took my voice in 1843 as well. Both times it waited until I had said what I needed to say. He thought about what this meant for the people still in the valley, the ones who had stayed, the ones who would wake tomorrow in their winter-ready homes and go about their days without knowing what was building in the sky to the north. He thought about whether they would feel it when it came, whether there would be a moment of recognition in the last hour before the storm, when the valley's purpose became clear even to those who had spent no time thinking about the valley's purposes. He thought about what it would mean if his father was right. If the silence was not the storm's precondition, but the valley's. If the valley had wanted something from the December of 1859, the same thing it had wanted from the December of 1843, and had used the winter and the blizzard to take it. If the two missing families, the couple on the north end, the young family with the small children, had not simply perished in the cold, but had been taken in a more deliberate sense by a place that had been waiting for the conditions under which it could take them. He did not like this line of thinking, and he could not stop it, and eventually he lay down in his blankets and stared at the dark above him and waited for morning. In the morning it was ordinary, the plateau under ordinary winter sky, the convoy stirring, the fires rebuilt, the animals fed, the ordinary work of a group of people in difficult circumstances, which was demanding enough to occupy the full attention and leave no room for the things that required more than full attention to hold. He got up and did his share of the ordinary work and was grateful for it. The blizzard reached Harrow Valley on the evening of the 5th day and stayed for 11 days. The people on the plateau felt the edges of it, 3 days of wind and hard snow that tested their camp but did not threaten it. They heard it before they felt it, a sound from the north that preceded the visible weather by several hours, a sound that those who described it afterward struggled to characterize, but that they agreed was unlike ordinary wind. Deeper than wind, more organized, as though the weather had a direction and a purpose and was not simply moving but going somewhere. When it passed the valley and reached them, it was wind and snow, cold and difficult and dangerous, but within the range of things a prepared group of people could endure. They endured it. In Harrow Valley, the 12 families who had refused to leave reported afterward, those who survived to report, that the storm had been of a different character than anything they had experienced in years of highland winters. The snow had come so fast and in such quantity that the valley floor was covered to a depth of 6 feet within the first 2 days, and the drifts against the north walls of structures had reached the roof lines by the 3rd. The cold had been absolute in a way several survivors described with the same word, independently, deliberate, as though the cold had intention, as though it had come specifically and was staying specifically, not the cold of weather moving through, but the cold of weather that had arrived at its destination. 8 of the 12 families who stayed came through it. 4 did not. Of the 4 families lost, 2 were found after the thaw in April, inside their cabins, intact, undamaged by anything other than the cold itself. They had simply stopped, the way things stop in extreme cold, without violence, without apparent suffering. They were sitting or lying in the positions of people who had gone to sleep. The other 2 were not found. Their cabins were intact. Their belongings were in place. The animals they had kept in the barn were dead from the cold. The families themselves, a couple in their 60s who had farmed the north end of the valley for 15 years, and a young family with 2 small children who had arrived only the previous spring, were absent. No trace of them was found in the cabin or in the surrounding snow when it finally melted in the spring. The investigation that followed was brief and inconclusive. The official account noted that the families had likely perished in the storm, and that their remains had been displaced or obscured by the extreme snowfall and subsequent melt. This was the available explanation, and it was not entirely implausible, and it was accepted by the county authorities who compiled the record. The people who had lived in the valley did not find it entirely satisfying, but they had no better one to offer, and in the years that followed, As the valley was resettled and life resumed, the unsatisfying explanation became the accepted one, and the accepted one became the only one, and the only one became the one that people repeated when they repeated the story at all, which eventually they did not. The silence had begun to lift from the survivors on the second day after the convoy left the valley. It did not lift all at once. It returned the way it had departed, gradually, one person at a time, over the course of 2 or 3 days. The first words were halting and tentative, as though the speakers were not entirely certain the faculty had returned and were testing it carefully. By the time they came down from the plateau and found shelter in the nearest settlement to the south, most of the affected were speaking again, if not with their full usual ease. August Column recovered his voice on the 3rd day. His first words, his daughter-in-law reported, were addressed to no one in particular. He had been sitting by the fire in the farmhouse where the family had been given shelter, wrapped in his quilts, and he had been quiet all morning, and then he had said, clearly and without preamble, it was worse this time. His daughter-in-law had gone to him immediately. She had asked what he meant. He had looked at the fire for a moment and said, in 1843, the silence took 4 days to reach everyone. This time it was faster. In 1843, only the valley was taken. This time it tried for the plateau. She had not understood the second part of this. She asked him to explain. He said, some of the people on the convoy, the ones camped on the plateau, they felt it reaching for them. She thought about the people she had sat beside around the fires on the plateau, the ones who had not been affected before they left the valley, but who had been quiet during the camp, not silent in the way of the affected, but quiet in the way of people who are listening to something they cannot quite hear. She said, what was it reaching for? He looked at the fire. He said, I don't know. In 1843, I thought it was the storm preparing its path, the storm taking the voice out of the land before it arrived. But this time, I'm not certain that's what it is. She waited. He said, I think the valley itself does something in extreme cold. I think it always has. I think it did it before there were people in it, and I think it will do it after we are gone from it, and I think what it does and what the storm does may not be 2 separate things. I think they may be the same thing. He did not explain further. He sat by the fire for the rest of that day and said very little. He lived for 4 more years, dying in 1863 at the age of 77, in a small house he had built on the plateau outside the valley. He did not return to Harrow Valley after the convoy. He was asked about this by his son on one occasion, and he said only that the valley had not finished with what it had to say, and he did not want to be present for the saying of it. His son did not go back immediately either. He took his family to a settlement south of the highland country and spent the winter there, and returned to the valley in the spring, when the blizzard's damage was clear and the lost families were confirmed. He did not rebuild in the valley. He built on the plateau. He did not know whether this was wisdom or cowardice, and he thought about it for the rest of his life without arriving at a satisfying answer. The valley was resettled within a few years by people with no knowledge of its history. By the 1870s, it was producing good crops and had rebuilt its mill and trading post and had a small school at the south end. The new residents found it a fine place to farm, sheltered from wind by the ridges, well watered by the creek with bottom land that rewarded the work put into it. They noticed the quiet, not a troubling quiet, a peaceful one, most of them said. The valley had a quality of stillness that was pleasant after the noise and exposure of open country. The ridges held the sound in. A person could hear themselves think. Some of the families who settled there in the early 70s were ones who had lived in other parts of the Highland country and had heard versions of the 1859 story, that a blizzard had struck the valley with the unusual severity, that some families had been lost. The story had simplified by then into something manageable: a bad storm, a hard winter, a tragedy of the kind that Highland winters produced from time to time. The part about the silence was sometimes included, and sometimes not, depending on who was doing the telling and how much they wanted to explain. The valley's history in the years between 1860 and the resettlement is a gap in the record. Who maintained the properties of those who left, or whether they were maintained at all? Whether anyone visited in that interim, and what they found. The county records offer nothing of use here. The surviving convoy members moved to other communities and rebuilt their lives with the particular forward-facing determination of people who have survived something they cannot fully account for and have chosen to account for it by not looking back. Some looked back. A man named Crade, who had farmed the center of the valley for 11 years, went back in the summer of 1860, 8 months after the blizzard. He did not go inside the valley. He climbed the east ridge to the gap and looked down from there. He was in the area on other business and had not planned the detour. He said later that he had simply wanted to see it. To see whether it was different in summer, whether the thing that had been wrong with it in December was specific to winter or present in some form year-round. He said it looked ordinary. Green in the bottomland, the creek running full from the spring rains, the structures of the valley still standing in their places. From the ridge, it looked like any valley in the Highland country. He said, "But I didn't go in." I looked at it for a while, and I turned around and I went back to my business. I don't know what I would have found if I had gone in. I decided I didn't need to know. This decision, the choice not to test the ordinary appearance of the thing, is perhaps the most honest record we have of how the convoy survivors related to the valley in the years immediately after. They did not return. They rebuilt. They told the story when they told it, and did not when they did not. They watched the valley fill with new people who did not know its history, and they did not, for the most part, go to those people with the history. They were not certain what use the history would be. They were not certain the new residents would hear it the way it needed to be heard. One family who moved into the valley in 1872 had a grandmother who had been on the convoy in 1859. She was in her 70s by then, still capable, still clear in her memory, and she lived with them in the valley for 3 years before her death. She had not wanted to come back, and she had come only because her family was coming, and she would not be separated from them. Her granddaughter, who was 12 when they moved in and 15 when the grandmother died, said later that the old woman had spent her 3 years in the valley in a state of continuous attention that she could only describe as watchfulness, not fear, not dread, the particular vigilance of someone who knows what they are watching for and is watching for it always, in the periphery of every day. The old woman had told the granddaughter, in one of the last conversations they had, that the valley was not a bad place. She wanted to be clear about that. It was not a bad place in the way of a place that wished harm to the people in it. It was a place that was simply not entirely for people, that had a life of its own that preceded and would outlast the people who farmed it, and that expressed this life on occasion in ways that people were not built to understand or withstand. She said this without bitterness and without fear, as a statement of fact. She said, the worst part in 1859 was not the silence. The silence you could manage. You had your hands, you had your face, you had the ways people communicate when words are gone. The worst part was watching my husband try to speak and knowing that what was using his voice was not him, that something had put its weight on the speaking part of him and held it down, and all he could do was look at me with his eyes and wait for it to let him up again. She said, "That is the thing I cannot forget. Not the storm, not the lost families, the look in his eyes while the valley held his voice." She said nothing further on the subject. She died in the spring of 1875 and was buried on the hillside above the valley in the cemetery that the new settlement had established there, where her grave still is. In the years immediately following the winter of 1859, Daniel Cullum spoke about what had happened to anyone who would listen, and to some who would not. He was not a dramatic man, and he did not tell the story dramatically. He told it the way his father had told him things, with care for the facts and with explicit acknowledgement of what he did not know, and with a consistent refusal to embellish beyond what he had observed. He was not always believed. He was often partly believed, in the way that accounts of unusual events are partly believed when they come from credible sources, the extraordinary elements set aside and the ordinary ones accepted, the result being a story that is accurate in its outline and wrong in its character. He wrote to the county authorities in the spring of 1860. He wrote a longer account the following year, which he sent to several people he thought might take it seriously. One of these was a professor at a college in St. Louis, who had written on the subject of unusual weather phenomena in the Highland country. The professor did not respond. He wrote to his father's family in the eastern part of the state, where relatives he had never met received the account and filed it among family papers, where it stayed for decades. He wrote in the last year of his life, a long document addressed to no one in particular, that his children found among his belongings after his death, and that one of them copied by hand and kept, and that the other two did not know what to do with. He died in 1887. He never returned to Harrow Valley. He never fully made his peace with the 12 families he had left behind, though he acknowledged when pressed that he could not have forced them to go and that the choice had been theirs to make. He said once, to his son, who asked him directly, "I carry the ones I could not reach, the ones on the north end who never knew the convoy was leaving. I carry them differently than the ones who chose to stay, but I carry them all." His son asked if he thought the ones who were lost, the 2 families who were never found, had suffered. Daniel thought about this for a long time. He said, "I don't know. I hope not. The valley didn't seem to me like a thing that wanted to cause suffering. It seemed like a thing that wanted something, and in the wanting of it, some people were simply in the path. Whether that is better or worse than cruelty, I cannot say. He could not say more than that. It was the closest he ever came to a conclusion, and he held it, loosely, as a man holds a tool he is not certain is the right one for the work. The records pertaining to the winter of 1859 in Harrow Valley are sparse and incomplete. The county records note the storm and its casualties in the brief administrative language of official documentation that has no framework for the stranger elements of what occurred. There is a deposition from Daniel Cullum, given to the county court in the spring of 1860, that covers the organization of the convoy and the losses among those who remained. It is a practical document, focused on the facts as they could be established, and it does not include the content of August Cullum's written note or the account of the voice. The note itself survived. It was preserved by Greer, the physician's assistant, who had received it from August Cullum on the morning before the convoy organized, and who kept it among his papers until his death, and then passed it, with the rest of his papers, to a nephew who eventually donated the collection to a county historical society in the 1890s. It remained in that collection, in a folder of miscellaneous documents from the 1850s and 1860s, largely unexamined, for many decades. A local historian who catalogued the collection in the early 1920s noted it briefly in her index as a document of uncertain provenance related to the blizzard of 1859, and moved on. The note reads exactly as it was recorded above. It is written on a piece of ordinary paper in a careful, old-fashioned hand. The words are steady. There is no sign of urgency or distress in the writing, no evidence that the man who wrote it was afraid. He was simply telling someone what he knew, as clearly and as usefully as he could, in the time he had before the valley finished taking what it had come for. At the bottom of the note, below the warning about the storm and the instruction to leave, there is a line that the historical record did not initially include, because the first person to transcribe the note read it as a separate notation unconnected to the main text. It is connected. It reads, "It took my voice in 1843 as well. Both times it waited until I had said what I needed to say. I do not know if this is mercy or if it simply had no use for silence until then." The question he posed there, whether what held the valley's voice was capable of something like mercy, or whether its timing was simply the timing of a thing that takes what it needs and leaves what it does not, is a question the record cannot answer. August Column could not answer it either. He lived 4 more years after the convoy, and he thought about it for all of them, and whatever conclusion he reached, if he reached one, he kept to himself. The valley kept its own counsel, as it always had. In the winters that followed the resettlement, people in Harrow Valley would sometimes notice, in the deep cold between Christmas and February, a quality of quiet that settled over the place in the early mornings. Not the absence of their own voices. They could speak. They spoke. They went about their days with the ordinary sound of lives being lived. But under the ordinary sound, at a depth that required stillness to hear it, there was something else. A quiet, within the quiet, a held breath. The long-time residents learned not to remark on it. Newcomers sometimes asked, in their first or second winter, whether others heard what they heard in the early mornings. That particular depth of silence beneath the everyday silence. That sense of something very large and very patient listening from inside the cold. The long-time residents said, "Yes, we hear it." And the newcomers asked, "What is it?" And the long-time residents said what they had learned to say, which was true and sufficient, and the only honest answer available. They said, "We don't know, but it has always been here, and it has not taken anything from us in a long time." They said it the way people speak about something they have decided to live alongside, rather than resolve. The valley endures. The winters come and go. The creek runs its course through bottomland that rewards the work put into it, and the ridges hold the sky in that particular way that enclosed places hold it, and the people who have come to it in the decades since 1859 have built their lives in it without incident that has been recorded. What goes unrecorded is the province of the people who choose not to record it, not from dishonesty, but from the practical understanding that some things do not fit into the forms that record-keeping provides. A quiet that seems deeper than weather. A morning in January when no one in the household speaks until the sun clears the east ridge, not because they cannot, but because the valley seems in that early hour to prefer it. Small things, the things that accumulate over years into a knowledge that no one article of evidence would justify, but that the accumulation makes undeniable. The valley has a preference. It has always had one. And in the deep of winter, when the cold is at its most complete and the world outside the ridges seems very far away, The valley expresses this preference in the only language available to it, which is silence. And the people who live within it have learned, over the generations, that this is not a thing to be resolved or resisted. It is only a thing to be known. The valley endures. The winters come and go. The silence in the deep cold settles in like a guest that knows it is welcome, whether invited or not. No one has heard the blizzard return. No one has stopped speaking since 1859. But there are mornings in January, in the hour before the light comes and the household sounds begin, when the valley holds a quality of attention that its residents can feel without being able to name, and they lie in their beds and do not speak, not because they cannot, but because the moment does not seem to call for it, because some silences are not empty, and some things that listen very carefully, and the valley has been listening for a very long time.